Thank you for having me here. I guess last year's ethics training went so well that we wanted to have a second round here. I'm Jim Schwartz. I'm a philosopher. I mostly think about ethics and space exploration, and today I'm going to talk about some ethical questions that world ship travel, right, multi-generation, multi-century travel might raise. All right. And so what I want to do here is give you something like an ethical roadmap to, a roadmap to ethically defensible world ship travel. You know, what are some things you've got to try to figure out to make sure that your mission isn't going to raise serious ethical difficulties. But to do this, I need to place this in a particular type of context. So I want to make some framing assumptions, things you might not agree with that I try to work out a lot more in the paper. And one of those is that I think, technologically speaking, world ship technology is going to come along far too late to be a means for saving humanity from global catastrophe. We're already going to be in space when this stuff comes around. We're going to have a healthy presence, say, in the asteroid belt, on other planets. So we're not going to get this technology in time to avert global catastrophe. It's also going to come along far too soon to be urgently needed to avert system-wide catastrophe. All right, the technology is going to be available before we really absolutely need it to escape the solar system, which means in the most likely context where it will occur, it will be ethically optional. And that's an important point going forward, that it's not something we absolutely have to do right when it becomes available. If that's right, if it is optional, ethically speaking, then we really, really have to worry about minimizing the harms and disadvantages associated with the people that are going to spend their entire lives aboard this ship, that they're not going to be outweighed by this sort of overall compelling moral argument for the mission in the first place. And in virtue of this, I want to say we need to think a little differently about how we ordinarily might as far as ensuring quality of life for the shipborne. And I think one thing we should try to avoid is just trying to get to some bare minimum consideration for them, make sure that they have a life that's barely worth living. Because if that's our guiding thought, then the question of the ethics for world ship is going to quickly turn into a race to the bottom. All right? So I think instead our focus should be on this. How can we make living aboard a world ship as desirable as possible? If we take that as the motivating thought, we are much less likely to run into serious problems down the road. So here's where I guess the sort of more technical areas of ethics come in. I think the issue of exploitation is one that lets us say some interesting things about what to do or what not to do when it comes to designing societies aboard the world ship. And to try to motivate a relevant intuition, as we often do in ethics, in particular applied ethics, we bring up cases, intuition pumps. So think about this case here. You've got a 14-year-old girl. She chooses to have a child, but because she's so young, she gives her child a bad start in life. Though this is going to have bad effects throughout the child's life, his life will predictably be worth living. But if the girl had waited for several years, she would have had a different child to whom she would have given a better start in life. And the intuition, maybe you don't share it, but I think it's a fairly compelling one, is that this is a case of wrongdoing because of the disadvantages this person would visit upon her child. That if only she waited a little longer, she would have avoided those disadvantages and harms. And I think this gives us a great analogy. Just replace the 14-year-old girl with the people that are building the ship, replace her child with the people that are going to live on the ship. Now, here's a sort of reaction that's very common. Well, hey, wait a minute. We're talking about ensuring quality of life for people that are going to live aboard this ship. And so you're sort of trying to push this position that we need to make their lives as desirable as possible. But don't we already accept pretty crummy living conditions for people here and now? And we say it's perfectly okay for people to reproduce in less than ideal circumstances? Sure, I'll grant that. But I think we're asking the wrong question when we're pursuing that. Because so often this question gets conceptualized as, imagine that you're a prospective parent already aboard the world ship. Is it okay for you to rear the next generation or not? And I think I'm willing to agree that, if I'm in that position, it is ethically permissible for me as a prospective parent to rear the next generation. But that's not the question we're asking right now, all right? It's not as though we're already, say, living behind the Iron Curtain or living in North Korea and wondering if it's okay to have kids. We're asking this question. Should we put people in that situation in the first place? Should we build the Berlin Wall. Should we institute policies that are going to cause our citizens to experience great harm? Right? That's our question here. Should we even do this in the first place? And the answer to that is, only if we've got a good reason to, and only if the harms are unavoidable. All right. And here's the thing, this idea that we've got to wait until we've got a healthy presence off Earth. Because given that amount of time, all of the disadvantages that we talk about, or at least the ones we can currently foresee, are avoidable. So we need a little patience here. All right, this is going to be part of some larger effort to increase human presence off Earth. All right, there's going to be a build-up to the technologies, and that build-up is going to be a very valuable learning experience. But what are some of the things we need to try to figure out here? Right. Don't have time for this one, but there's a worry that if the conditions aboard the ship are really bad, joining the mission in the first place is going to be like selling yourself into slavery, and you're not allowed to do that. All right, but anyway. This is going to relate to some things that Or Corin talked about in his wonderful talk yesterday. I'm going to take as a premise here that liberal democratic society is an ideal that we want to strive for. Maybe it's not perfectly realizable, but it's something we think it's a good form of government, and it would be nice to see that aboard the world ship. But we have this problem not just for a world ship, but in space settlements, that you have to balance personal liberties against the security and well-being of the entire community. Right? We're talking about people living aboard a vessel. If somebody opens the wrong door, you vent the atmosphere and everyone dies. This is a question that Charles Cockell has posed to some groups over the past few years, and we've got about 3 books that we've written, edited volumes, trying to address this balance of personal liberties against security in space settlements. And we really don't know, how can you have a desirable form of government that also keeps everyone fed and safe in space? So what you can see sometimes in, say, the science fiction literature is you've got ideas of long-lived institutions that you try to implement aboard a ship. Harry Harrison's Captive Universe, for instance. So oftentimes in discussions here, the Catholic Church gets brought up as a form of social organization that's lasted for millennia. But we have to ask, if that's the model you go with, are those institutions ones that are good at keeping people alive, good at maintaining the kind of knowledge the crew members would have to have? And I think something that bugs us about those sorts of stories, and I'm also thinking, Orphans in the Sky from Heinlein, that it's not just that these people are living in deplorable conditions, but we've lost touch with them, or they've lost touch with us. That I think one thing we value is that there's a cultural continuity between the society that sends out the mission, the type of life people live aboard the ship, and then the society that develops at the target system. That we want them to be us. Right? And so if we have a dramatically different form of social organization, that's almost like we're sending out a different culture. All right? So I think something that would be desirable, if feasible, is that the form of social organization you have aboard the ship isn't dramatically different from the forms that society takes in the solar system when the mission departs. But this is a tough thing. We don't know what's going to work here, and we're not going to have any real good ideas until we actually have a lot of experience living off of Earth. All right? So this is one reason we need to be patient, because there are just so many unanswered questions about, as far as the design of society overall, what's going to work, what isn't. Things we worry about in the science fiction stories, what do you teach the kids aboard the ship? And you often see that very rigid and strict curricula are presented. You teach the kids only what they need to know to stay alive to maintain the ship's systems. I think that's a bad idea. Because we can't anticipate all of the problems that people are going to face aboard a ship like this. You're much better off if you have a more liberal arts style education where people are more flexible intellectually. They're more creative, because those are the people that are better able to adapt to problems that arise, to develop new solutions, to improve the technology, and ideally create new knowledge while they're aboard this ship. Right? You never know what backups to backups are going to fail. Right? If you've got something that would be catastrophic for people that only know how to fix one system, the people that have this more breadth of knowledge might find a solution to some double backup failure. Right? And just think about what it's like to be a person living here. Right? If the only skills I know are how to fix this particular device and I know nothing else, my life's going to be a lot worse than if, when I'm off work, I've got some sort of hobby to engage in. I know about music or poetry. The list here could be really long in terms of what could make my life more fulfilling. So maybe you don't have people that are just poets, but you've got, physicist poets, right? Along with this is going to be issues more directly related to vocation. And if we're talking about avoiding exploitation, avoiding these, wrongful harms or disadvantages, one thing you'd like is that people have some amount of freedom to choose what vocation they're going to enter into. And, so the more opportunity you have here, the better, the less likely you are to be exploitative. And so what you'd want to see is a population that's big enough so that you can get all of the vital work done, for the most part, just by people that want to do that in the first place. Okay, we're going to have some market inducements here that affect what lines of work people go into, but those are going to go way too far if you end up with extreme power imbalances in the process. All right, so it's a sign that your world-ship population is far too small if the people that perform the vital roles have all of the power, or a great majority of it. And here's a big one, reproductive autonomy. All right. One thing we also want to make sure is that your population is big enough so that you're able to reproduce at replacement only using the people that want to engage in those activities. So I'm not suggesting you start your mission this way, but even if you did start just with, heterosexual couples that wanted to have kids, people are going to be people. Here's what's going to happen in future generations. You're going to have people that don't want to have kids. You're going to have gay people, bisexual people, asexual people. You're going to have people that have orientations that we don't even have terms for right now. You're going to have transgender people, agender people, genderqueer people, people with gender identities that, the concepts don't necessarily exist yet, people that want to have intimate relationships of forms that don't even exist yet, and moreover, people with mental and physical disabilities. If you can't allow these people to lead, reasonable lives aboard your world ship, I don't want you anywhere near the planning office. Because here's the thing, it is an absolute wrong to force anyone into reproductive activity that doesn't want to do it. All right? And so if your world ship population is so small that you have to do that, right, that's something that is far below the ethically permissible level for that population. And let's be clear about what you would be asking to have happen there. We are talking about rape. If your population is so small that people have to be forced into reproductive activity, you are not only countenancing rape for one amount of people, but rather for generations. All right. So let's be very clear about what would happen aboard that ship. Let's not paper over how awful that would be. So size here is going to be an important factor, and I'm trying to visualize here the relationships that I'm talking about. So when we start here, right, we've got a small ship population, and basically everyone has to work, everyone has to engage in reproductive activity, but then as that population increases, the percentage of people you need decreases until you get to some minimum. This is qualitative. What are the real slopes? What are those numbers exactly? I don't know. I want to find out. Now, eventually you reach these minima where, okay, now here we've got enough people where we can reproduce at replacement only using people that want to engage in those activities. When we're here, we've got enough people that you can fill all of the vital roles without having to coerce people into those lines of employment. What are these numbers? I'd really like to know. We really need to know in advance of sending out a world ship mission. So, if we try to go before we are able to address these, right, this is when we're going to have this avoidable exploitative treatment of the shipborne. And that might sound like a depressing thought, but I think this is a positive thought. I think this is encouraging because we've got the time to figure this out. It's not as though we're going to do this tomorrow, right? We're talking about a few hundred years into the future. We're going to have all sorts of new developments that are going to let us figure out answers to questions about, how many people do you have to have aboard to satisfy these conditions. So some don'ts and do's, right? Let's not presuppose that what I've mentioned here are the only issues that you might face, right? There are going to be problems that we can't anticipate here and now, all right? Science fiction is very helpful here to sort of, present case studies for consideration, but it's not clairvoyant, right? Just because something hasn't come up in the SF literature doesn't mean it's not a problem that the shipborne will face. Let's not presume that our experience on Earth completely covers all of the possibilities. One thing that could happen is once you get societies out there in space, they might adapt in ways where you've got entirely novel social structures. Right, so just because we think something is common to all terrestrial cultures doesn't mean that's going to be an element that has to be the case in a space-based or world ship culture. And again, this is reinforcing a thought from before, avoid thinking that all we have to do is reach the bare minimum, because that's an unproductive thought that leads the ethical question to a race to the bottom. And I think that is a thoroughly unproductive and harmful mindset to have, because we're talking about people here, right? We're not talking about little units that just exist on this vessel. Those units are people. And this is my sort of comment, at least to the more engineering types. This is not just an engineering issue, right? Awaiting some inevitable engineering solution, okay? Because again, we are dealing with people here, not perfectly designed systems. So what should we do rather than don't in this sense? Well, hey, let's still encourage technology development. The more tools we have at our disposal, the better we will be able to handle issues related to these. Human exploration of the solar system is going to be very important here, in particular, so we can learn from both successful and unsuccessful attempts at settlement various places in the solar system. All right. And again, reinforcing this thought again that, hey, let's make our aim to make life as good as possible aboard the ship. And for this, you can't do it just with space science alone. We need sociology, we need anthropology, we need economics, we need political science, we need philosophy. All of these disciplines are going to have to be brought to bear. And I was very happy for Orr Korn's talk, because it's sort of giving us an example of, here's a way that political science and sociology can really contribute to answering questions about how to avoid, in his case, conflict aboard world ships. That sort of stuff. I'd love to see much more of it. So thank you.
Have you considered the possibility of, say, multiple world ships in a fleet with some crossover between the various ships as a way to mitigate some of these problems?
Yeah, that issue in particular doesn't come up in the paper, but yeah, that would be a way of allowing more freedom if you've got the ability to move from one ship to the other. If you're, experimenting with slightly different organizations from one, so I don't like this one here, but I can move over there. Practical difficulties, because you might end up with a lot of people wanting to go to A, and so now C is no longer sustainable. But yeah, that could be a way to build in more opportunity. If it's not just one vessel, but a fleet of them in close proximity. I know Alistair Reynolds has a nice book where they send out a whole bunch of asteroids like this.
Quick comment and then a question, but it sounds like if we're able to solve this, then we've basically created a perfect society, which would be a good thing. But it might be worth thinking about the implications of creating a perfect society on a world ship and then leaving the rest of the solar system to its typical human circles, in which case are we creating an imbalance by creating a perfect society on a world ship? There's no good answers for that one, but I think it'd be an interesting follow-up paper. The question I had, though, was, have you thought about the implications of a splinter group creating a world ship to take themselves out of society, and does society have a duty to stop them from doing that if it doesn't meet the needs of its people?
Yeah, so it depends. What is this splinter group doing? What have they built into their design? Right. So if we're in like an Iron Sky situation where it's the Nazi regime that makes the world ship, I'm going to say, yeah, we got to stop them. They ought not exist anywhere in space. But if you satisfy these criteria, if you're providing people with a life that's acceptable, that's worth living, it's hard to come up with strong objections to that. So, yeah, I hadn't thought about that issue in great detail, but thank you for the question, though.
If we assume that some Canadian astronomers are right, that we are actually approaching Sirius, and that we'll be very in close proximity to Sirius, and therefore we are already a world ship, how would you assess how would you grade the Earth as a world ship?
Yeah, and I think this relates to the comment before that, I'm making these arguments about what you want to do on a world ship, but then, how close do we even get here? And I'm somewhat tempted by the thought that, there are some avoidable issues that we have here and now that we'd like to resolve. And, if we never resolve them, then what hope do we have aboard the world ship? So I don't know if this is going to directly answer the question, but just because we can't meet the ideal case doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about what the ideal case is and work as hard as we can to get there. This is a sort of a common objection when people in my position talk about space policy issues. You know, I do a lot of work on more near-term stuff related to, say, asteroid mining policy. And, okay, you know, what I'm presenting is, you know, here's what I think. I've got a compelling ethical argument. This is a good way to do things. Is that realistic? Probably not. But if we don't have that standard to strive for, that's, again, you know, we worry about that race to the bottom issue. So, you know, I'm outlining here are some ideal conditions you want to try to meet. So if we can get close to those, good. If we're working towards them, great. I've got to stop. But thank you.